Uh, Thank you for having me here and to be able to speak about our research. I do want to say that this is what I'm going to talk about is not a solo project. My fellow investigator is Jeff Alpert, who's not with us today here, as well as Andrew Hansen, who is our graduate student that was key and instrumental in getting this project done. I guess I could start with how we got involved in this. And as Dr. Lab talked about, my background is in law enforcement, switched over, went the academic route. But I've always had an orientation to doing applied research, working with law enforcement agencies. And as has my partner on this, Jeff Alpert, has a long history of doing this work. And we saw the solicitation come out. We were looking at it and saying, you know, we're having essentially an exchange. As we've done this, we've done these kind of partnerships, we've had good experiences, we had things that haven't worked as well. And you know, we've talked to others, and I'm sure some in this room have been through the same experience. And so what our thought was what makes these partnerships work? What can we learn from these that are positives as well as barriers? And from that, maybe provide information that will expand the utilization of these partnerships. Now, the idea of partnerships is not new. I mean, we can go back to the 1967 President's Commission, the idea of merging the idea of science and social science into the practice of criminal justice agencies. But I think in the policing realm, it really starts with community-oriented policing. In the sense that agencies, as they start adopting this, wanted community surveys, they wanted insight from law enforcement agencies on the topic to help develop training. And as a result, you start to see the emergence of these relationships. Support comes from organizations like NIJ, the COPS Office, BJA, and projects such as Ceasefire, the Local Initiated Research Partnership, PSN, et cetera, that really help foster and build relationships. And in return, as we talked about it, the practitioner researcher initiatives that are now coming back out with NIJ. And it's not only in that crowd, but also in the law enforcement crowd as well, where you have law enforcement agencies, for example, executives, law enforcement executives, chiefs, sheriffs, and so forth, who've done this kind of work, and have now become strong advocates, publishing articles in academic journals, as well as things like Police Chief Magazine advocating for these relationships. And also, I think what's become a very strong advocacy in the law enforcement community is the International Association of Chiefs Police. In 2004, they held a symposium, came up with some working documents to help law enforcement practitioners and researchers to develop working relationships, to develop the Research Advisory Committee, who has a mission of supporting these relationships. But more interestingly, they made the argument that all law enforcement agencies should have some type of partnership with researchers. And this was the goal of their efforts. And that was our jump-off point. So that was the goal of our effort. And the first thing we asked was, what is the prevalence of it? Where do we stand right now? And how many agencies engage in these type of partnerships? But the real core of our project was the idea of what are the barriers and facilitators to developing and sustaining these type of partnerships. And we did this, and I'll go over real quickly these kind of points, what we did to do this. We did a national survey of about 2,000 law enforcement agencies and asked them about are they engaged in partnerships, the characteristics of those partnerships, and a more general question about their utilization of research. But the core of that project was this essentially interviews of 100, when we step back, we used the surveys to identify agencies who were engaged in these partnerships. From that, we identified 100 in a way, ended up working out, we ended up picking 106, to interview first the practitioner, and then interview the research partner in this project to get their working perspective. And the idea was to understand that key question of what are the barriers and facilitators to developing and sustaining these partnerships. And then the last component of this research was we went out to agencies who had sustainable partnerships with the researcher over time, and we used them as models, and they varied on degrees of formality, being formal, informal, whether it's a single researcher involved or maybe a whole department or sociology or criminology, whatever it may be. But what I'm going to focus on today is largely that second point, and I want to talk about the barriers and facilitators. I'll talk a little bit, I'll give you kind of just a graph about that prevalence question that kind of may or may not be a surprise to you. And I'll also utilize some of the video clips we did as a part of that fourth component where we videotaped both the practitioner and researcher at the same time to get kind of their ideas, and that was the idea of spreading that message from those who were actually doing it. But what I really want to talk about is, one, from the words of those involved, what are the benefits from the researcher and practitioner perspective? And what is essentially the barriers and facilitators? And I divided it down into two categories. One is kind of organizational structural, and one is interpersonal. And we'll talk about that when we look through that. Real quickly, on the nature of partnership. we looked at 3 types when we surveyed. And we asked them, we took this from IACP, we asked agencies in the last 5 years that you engage in a partnership. And then we asked them